Should Ukraine be mobilizing men under the age of 25? Привет, my name is Connor Klein, an expert in international relations, have been living in Ukraine for many years, speak Ukrainian and Russian, so I'm here to give you a more nuanced, informed and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the geopolitical events surrounding it. So, Ukraine is facing an existential defensive war against Russian aggression, and it has had limited mobilization so far. Originally, it was only men over 28 were eligible for mobilization. Then that was lowered to 25. And the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has had a pretty open dispute and disagreement with the Biden administration about lowering that conscription age down potentially to 18 years of age. So why is this? Why, if Ukraine is facing such an existential crisis, are they refusing quite openly to lower the conscription age? So Zelensky's public argument is kind of, I guess, about two parts. One part is that the real focus should be on arming Ukraine, not mobilizing more men. And there is a little bit of gruesome cynicism in this, in the sense that the Biden administration has never articulated that they actually have a strategy for Ukraine to win the war, only that they do not want to see Ukraine lose the war. And as a result, they have slow-dripped military aid, put on restrictions, never equipped the Ukrainians with enough military hardware in order to win the war. That has been one of the big criticisms of the Biden administration's approach. And as a result, the more men that Ukraine would conceivably mobilize without the necessary equipment in order for those soldiers to be in the best position to defeat Russia, perversely, that might mean that the US would slow drip the equipment and the hardware and the rockets even more, because then, well, Ukraine is not going to collapse if it's mobilized more soldiers. Of course, that would mean that potentially more Ukrainian men would die. So there is a little bit of logic in saying, well, we're not going to mobilize, so therefore you're going to have to give us more weapons in order for Ukraine to be able to have the same impact on the battlefield. Now, of course, Donald Trump is going to take over in the second half of January, and he seems less inclined to provide Ukraine with military aid, so we'll have to see what happens with conscription at that point. But Zelensky has been rather steadfast in refusing to do that. Now, the second thing is actually Ukraine's demographics. So I'm going to put up a chart. You can see the Ukrainian demographics. Look on the side that's to do with men. Women are not being conscripted, although the stat I saw said that 8% of the Ukrainian armed forces are women. Doesn't mean they're all in combat roles, obviously, but they are also serving, but they are not obliged to be in the military. There is no mobilization of women. And as you see, the demographic bulges go in and out, and the biggest chunk of Ukrainian men are actually around the 35-40 years of age range. So they were born basically during the final days of the Soviet Union, when fertility rates in Ukraine were higher. They dropped in the 1990s and have continued with some variation on a downward trend since then. So when you look at it, there are actually twice as many men in that kind of segment around 35-40 than there are between 18 and 25. There's actually very few Ukrainian men of that age. It looks about half, roughly, when you look at the chart. So that gives you an indication that there's actually a generation, or a part of a generation of Ukrainians that are in that 18 to 25, which are very few in number. And potentially that would mean that if they were mobilized and many of them were to die in the fighting, that Ukraine would have an even more severe demographic shortage going forward of men of that age. So they are very sensitive to seeing that part of their population fighting and dying in the war, especially if they are not there as volunteers. Obviously, they can sign up as volunteers for the military if they're between 18 and 25, but they were not going to be mobilized or conscripted into the army. Now, the second part of that demographic issue is that men in Ukraine tend to have children younger than, say, what is typical in the US or in Western Europe, although that age has been rising over the last decade. And as a result, most men between 18 and 25 still don't have children, but between, say, 25 and 35, most Ukrainian men who are going to have children during that period. So the likelihood of them already having offspring and left their genetic lineage and another generation to come on is a lot higher once they're over 25 than this 18 to 25 age demographic. And you would potentially have already a very small generation or subgeneration of Ukrainians who have not actually reproduced, who will go then and fight, and if they're killed, obviously, or very, very badly invalided, they would not have the opportunity to leave offspring. So this is part of the huge problem. Not only would you have this cohort of Ukrainians potentially dying and not being able to continue as a generation and causing, obviously, a population issue going forward, you'd have a generation, 18 to 25, well, 18 years later, I guess, that would be entering adulthood that would be even smaller if, more of these guys die without having children. Then it's going to be men between 35 and 40, which in Ukraine would mean they probably have already reproduced much, well, maybe not as much as they would otherwise, but there's less of an impact throughout the generations. So the argument is twofold, that basically Ukraine should get more arms rather than having to mobilize more men, because there is the perception that the US could give them more military aid, and that maybe by mobilizing soldiers that this aid will not come. And the second part is the huge demographic impact that mobilizing men between 18 and 25 and significant numbers of them dying in the war would have on the Ukrainian population and its future. It's also something that has been highlighted by the former Ukrainian commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, who is now the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom, that Ukraine would basically be sacrificing the future generations, and then what future would the country have if they are killed in the war, especially if they haven't been able to leave any offspring before they tragically pass away in the fighting. So those are the arguments by which Ukraine is being very stubborn about not mobilizing men under the age of 25. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It is quite unusual to see in this situation where we have Russia, which doesn't, you just have to listen to what Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, says. He doesn't believe that Ukraine is even a real place. He doesn't believe in it being independent of Moscow. So it is an existential war, a defensive war against an enemy that wants to remove the idea of Ukraine as an independent state. So in most of these situations, if you're going to conscript, then generally conscription would be for all adult males at least. You can also, of course, discuss if there would need to be some mobilization of women in particular roles as well. That has been mooted in the past. You have countries like Israel that face existential crises almost constantly, that have military participation by basically most of the population, whether they're male or female, mostly adult population if they're male and female, with a few exceptions. And is that the way that Ukraine would have to be going forward if Russia remains a looming and large aggressive threat on its border after maybe there's a cessation of hostilities? Although I'm not, if you listen to my interviews, I'm not really that optimistic that we're going to see any end to the war early in 2025 with the Trump administration taking over. Potentially towards the end of 2025, that may be more realistic. So I'll finish the video there about Ukrainian demographics. And if you are interested in traveling to Ukraine, I have possibly the only real guide to going there at the moment with the logistics and safety information, as well as my hospitality guide for major cities like Kyiv, Odessa, Chernovtsi, Lviv, and Uzhhorod. I don't have the cities that are closer to the front line, since probably you will not be going to those because of the increased danger level. But definitely, if you are considering going to Ukraine, you need to obviously take care of your own personal safety. There's a link to that down below in the description to this video, and I will end the video there and see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini! Героям слава!